Okay, what you're looking at here, this bottle of filth is what came out of my differential. So basically I finished my project Rubicon. I took it off-road for the first time, didn't realize there was a leaking axle seal until I found all kinds of green sludge coming out of there. So what we're going to do now is replace both of the inner axle seals in my front Dana 44 Rubicon with locker. So to start, obviously, I loosen the lugs while it's on the ground. I'm going to jack it up, and then while the brakes are on, I'm going to loosen everything so I can start taking stuff apart. You're going to need the brakes for the axle nut socket, which is a 36mm. I'll show it to you guys shortly. Once you have the tires off, you got to keep the brake on because we're going to need it to remove this axle nut. So there's a cotter pin and a little cover, and then it's a 36mm, and someone's got to hold the brake while you undo it. And then we got to take these 1/2 inch, there are 2 slide bolts on the caliper, 1, 2. The whole caliper will come off, the rotor will come off, and then with a bit of beating we'll get the unit bearing off and then be able to pull the axle shaft out. Here is the axle nut, so there's just like a little spring washer in this thing after the cotter pin, then the axle nut, and then a washer. And like I said, 2 1/2 inch slide bolts on the caliper, pull that off, pull the rotor off, and then we'll slide the whole axle shaft out. I misspoke actually, before you can pull the shaft out, we have to pull the unit bearing. Has 3, they're 12-point 1/2 inch bolts, 1, 2, and 3, and there will be another 8mm bolt if you have ABS. But so yeah, these 3 bolts, and then a lot of times we might have to beat this unit bearing off, or another trick is to put a socket on the back of one of these and then turn the wheel and let power steering do the work to pop it out, because right now it's just really seated on the axle shaft. We'll see. So I'm having trouble with the driver's side unit bearing, and I have this 3-jaw puller that would work perfectly, but I'm afraid of it. It's going to pull the bearing off by pushing in on the axle shaft, and I'm afraid of it damaging something on the inside, so I'm not going to do this. What I think I'm going to have to do is thread a bolt back in and put a socket on it, and then use power steering to turn the wheel, have the back of the socket push against the C on the axle, and thereby pop the bearing out. So we removed the diff cover. You got 10 1/2 inch bolts. And then we're going to clean the mating surface. There's all kinds of RTV that I'm going to scrape off with the flat edge and then get a file to make it nice and smooth. And then we had to move the tie rod out of the way. It's just a cotter pin and a 3/4 inch nut. And then it pops out. You might need a pickle fork. But yeah. So once I took out these 4 3/4 inch bolts, the whole carrier just popped out. You might need to force it with the pry bar, but it came out pretty easy for me. And then here's the inside of it. We're obviously going to clean everything, but first I'm going to do the seals. So I tried a seal puller, didn't really work, so I got this big socket. It's 1 7/16 inch, and I'm just going to hammer each of them out from their respective sides. And then we'll have to do the opposite to press the new ones in. So this is how I did it, using the same 1 7/16 inch. You can see the seal just seated, and use pretty much all the extensions you have, especially for the passenger side. And that's it, and just make sure it's really clean. Hope you guys can see this. So before we reinstall the carrier, I have a little piece of toothpick. On this is the sensor, so it knows when the locker is actuated, and a fishing wire attached to it. So that way when I put the carrier in, it doesn't fuck with the sensor, and then I can pull the toothpick out after. And just make sure again that the shims that were on either side go back on the same side, and even the bearing caps go in the exact same way with the same bolts. So these 4 bearing cap bolts, I put some Loctite on them and tightened them in a crisscross pattern to 80 foot-pounds. And then I threw the axle shafts in real quick, and you can actually test your locker to make sure that the toothpick method worked. If you look right through that little hole, you can see if the teeth mate, and then you can check your dashboard and make sure the light's on. I think for normal Rubicon, you actually might have to turn your car on. I wouldn't go that far, but I wired mine independent of the ignition. So if you have that, you can do what I just did. But yeah, so once these are torqued down, we're just going to put a new faceplate on, actually, with, I'm using a lube locker reusable gasket, and then fill it up with 1.375 quarts of, I'm using 85W140, and then that should be it. And the 10 faceplate bolts go to 30 foot-pounds.